My name is Adrienne Gruber, and I'm the author of Buoyancy Control. It's obviously a term from scuba diving. One of the most important things while you're diving is to have good buoyancy control in the water so that you don't descend too fast or ascend too fast. And that's one of the key things that while you're learning to dive that they sort of drill into you. So when I started working on the book, I was also learning how to dive at the same time. And I got very sort of interested in that idea of being kind of, floating, being a little bit weightless, but also having to be very in control of your space and your body. And so that's sort of where the title came from. I wrote a lot of these poems, or the first drafts of these poems, in Mexico when I was staying. I was staying on an orange farm, my brother-in-law's orange farm, and but I was also doing a lot of diving trips, so I was sort of spending a lot of time in Mexico on land, but then also in the water. And of course, the water lends itself to fluidity pretty organically and obviously. And while I was doing the diving, I sort of started looking at all the different sea creatures that I was observing and thinking about, their shape is all fluid, as well as sort of their ways of reproducing and the way they mate with each other and all kinds of things. And of course, I came back to human bodies and how fluid sexuality is and how fluid identity is, and all of those things sort of came together in the poems. I found as I was writing poems for the book, and I didn't realize that they were going to become a book yet. I was definitely doing a lot of identity exploration. I had just gotten out of a bad relationship, and so I was in my head a lot. I was not in a very good place, but I started to I was trying to get back to myself a little bit, and I think getting back to myself was in part an exploration of identity, an exploration of sexual identity, exploring my body, but also exploring bodies in general. And of course, sort of as I was getting more into scuba diving and seeing all these different sea creatures and aquatic life, I became just fascinated with that sort of body fluidity. I'm originally from the prairies, and I had never been sort of that interested in being a nature poet per se, even though I love the prairies. I think they're beautiful. But I found landscapes, I think, are quite beautiful, but I've never found a way to sort of enter them in terms of writing about them. And then as soon as I got in the water, I realized that was the space that opened me up and allowed me to really write about sort of nature, essentially, and the natural world. So what I find, I sort of feel like a lot of the poems in the kind of land section are more about being stuck in my head and sort of being a little bit like trying to stay in control and trying to keep my life together. And then sort of the next section with a lot of the water poems are sort of about giving up control and sort of allowing myself to just be open and be fluid and just kind of be in my body as more of a sort of fluid thing, I guess. I think there's some incredible nature poetry out there about, landscapes within Canada. I do feel that some of the poems in my book sort of take place in different bodies of water in Canada as well. Some lakes in Ontario, as well as the West Coast, because that's where I live now. So there's definitely a connection. I like to hope that I may be doing something a little bit differently than what's been done before, just because I'm kind of exploring bodies of water by actually being in the body of water myself and sort of having a really visceral experience with that body of water. So hopefully that's bringing something a little bit new and fresh. definitely, I feel that my book is more of a feminist look at landscape, and since it does explore a woman's sexuality and bodies and how they relate to each other, and it's not sort of the traditional male gaze on landscape. It's a completely feminist perspective, absolutely. A lot of the rough drafts were written, would have been like probably about 8 years ago. And then they've been, obviously heavily revised. And then a few new pieces have surfaced over the last few years. But over the last couple of years, it's just been sort of revising the book and trying to figure out the structure and how all the poems would flow. So in that time period, I've had kids. I've started working on brand new material about my experiences having kids. So it's actually really nice to have had such a long time to be able to go back to these poems, revise them, revisit them, work with different writers, workshopping them. I feel like now that the book is finally here, even though maybe 5 years ago it looked quite different, it's now exactly what I hoped it would be and how I hoped it would be presented to the world. So that kind of distance actually was really wonderful. So I'm going to read two pieces. The first one is a little bit about a road trip that I took to Mexico to get there. This is called Proposal. Let's make babies, something solid that slips with its own mucus trap, screaming at the world, betrayal with its first breath. This has nothing to do with love, it's basic sorcery, what you can do for me. We climb out of caskets, once sawed in half. Birth magicians, like breath, like the sticky remains on the Trans-Canada, the deer whose legs I ran over in the middle of the night. The substance we are after, all color, a freshly painted room, where the smell silences those first few brain cells. A man pushes 2 fingers inside me and groans, the liquid phase. You taste tart, he says, and lowers his mouth. Remember the truck stop cherry pie I ate the night we couldn't get to Oklahoma? The quiver of fruit, membrane on my tongue, how a jellyfish dissolves on hot sand. Think of the baby who thrust out the placenta, its inverted twin. Think of my mother who couldn't hold her bowels as she pushed out my sister, the nurse trying to convince her, pressure in the uterus, and what he moans in my ear, trying to reach deeper, a canker in the mouth, a dark hair wisping from the breast. A dark hair wisping from the breast, a canker in the mouth, in my ear, trying to reach deeper, pressure in the uterus, and what he moans out, my sister, the nurse trying to convince her, who couldn't hold her bowels as she pushed its inverted twin. Think of my mother, who thrust out the placenta on hot sand. Think of the baby, membrane on my tongue, how a jellyfish dissolves. The quiver of fruit I ate the night we couldn't get to Oklahoma. Remember the truck stop cherry pie, his mouth, the liquid phase. You taste tart, he says, and lowers. A man pushes 2 fingers inside me and groans, where the smell silences those first few brain cells. We are, after all, color, a freshly painted room. I ran over in the middle of the night, the substance on the Trans-Canada, the deer whose legs, like the sticky remains, like breath, once sawed in half. Birth magicians. We climb into caskets with love, its basic sorcery, what you can do for me, betrayal with its first breath. This has nothing to do with its own mucus trap, screaming at the world. Let's make babies, something solid that slips. I'll just read one more piece. This is actually the title poem. This poem is called Buoyancy Control, which is, of course, the title of the book. And there's a quote from Karen Soley that says, studies show your demographic does well to take up hobbies. Deflate. Weighted hips allow you to sink. Bubbles rise to the surface. Descent is an act of control. Swallow. Move through meters of water and calculate. Swallow again. Stop here. Pinch your nose. A forced drowning. Fins erect. I am not a fish. I am not equipped. Jaw jiggle. It's unnatural. Canned air. Drift up a few feet and settle. The birth of each breath is recycled. Dead air finds its way through clefts in the lungs. The evidence trapped, bubble in the brain. Below, surface direction is lost. The drone of a motor occupies the space where gravity remains a trick question. Don't ask. Instead, note your surroundings. Clear the mask and sing a stream of bubbles to the sky. The instrument used to stay alive constricts your lungs. Swallow. Recycled air. Claustrophobic haze. Think possibilities. Running out of breath. Gloom behind your eyes. You are hugged by equipment. This is all the love anyone needs.